Now, I have described NBC as a radio network, and I think I should probably explain that point because two crucial things to understand about the structure of US broadcasting that distinguish it from European broadcasting systems like the BBC and RTE. The first thing is to understand again, I will emphasize this point again and again, just how reliant it is and how exclusively reliant it is upon commercial revenues, upon advertising revenues, and upon revenues to be earned from allowing outside firms unconnected with broadcasting to sponsor shows that are going to be broadcast on a radio network or subsequently on a television network. So it's commercially focused. But the second characteristic is this networking approach. So what is networking? The networking approach is particularly appropriate to large geographical territories or markets like the United States, where there is an inherent difficulty in attempting to create one station that can cover all of that area. So a radio network is a network system which distributes programming to multiple stations simultaneously. And that's a way basically of extending the total coverage of the original station of the network, if you like, the hub of the network, beyond the limits of a single broadcast signal. The result of this is to expand the audience for radio programming. And it means that it's possible to apply the benefits of mass production to the broadcasting enterprise. Say, for example, you're NBC in the 1920s and you want to sell advertising across the continental United States. But there's no way you can, with a single transmitter, reach the entire continental United States. It's just not possible. It just can't transmit that far. We'd have to be incredibly powerful. So what do you do? Well, you've got two choices, I guess. One, assuming that you're starting from somewhere on the East Coast in somewhere like New York, you could gradually acquire local stations right across the United States in every significant market, of which there are literally hundreds, and build a system that way. But that's going to take you time and it's going to be incredibly expensive. A second option is basically what defines networking. You connect your central station in, let's say, New York, via telephone lines, which is where AT&T come in. They're absolutely crucial for this, to radio stations dotted right across the continental United States. So in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Albuquerque, in Montana, wherever it might be, down to Florida. You transmit a signal via a telephone a cable. That cable is picked up by a local station in, let's say, Los Angeles. It is retransmitted using a relatively low power Los Angeles based transmitter, and it's rebroadcast to audiences in the Los Angeles area. So this means that a station that is based in New York, for example, can basically be picked up live in Los Angeles. Furthermore, there's absolutely no requirement for the New York-based station to own the Los Angeles station. All that is required is that there is some kind of relationship or an affiliation, key term here, between the Los Angeles station and the New York station, and that's usually a contractual relationship. And stations which affiliate themselves to networks are basically described as network affiliates, so hence that key term. You can get a sense of this by looking at this chart here. This describes the US television network system as of basically 2013. So you've got 5 television networks, the same, 3 of which basically grew out of being radio networks, so NBC, CBS, and ABC, which were radio networks in the 1940s, moved down into television. But you've also got, in television, you have the addition of Fox from the 1980s and CW, which is owned by the Warner Brothers, or Warner Communications, Time Warner rather, from the 1990s. So NBC can be received right across the continental United States, but the NBC only actually owns stations, that is local stations, in 10 cities across the United States. The vast majority of the stations which are broadcasting or which are networking the NBC signal are independently owned stations, again dotted around various major markets in the United States, of which there are approximately 200. And there are 200 key markets basically across the US. So as you can see, virtually all of them, CBS, ABC, have about 200 stations each. Fox are in and around that. CW now has slightly more than that. And the way this works in the contemporary moment is that those affiliated stations don't broadcast NBC signal all day long. They really just use NBC during primetime hours, so between about 7 to 10 o'clock in the evening, 7:30 to 10:30 in the evening. And for its part, NBC is interested in this arrangement because it basically gets to sell advertising right across the United States during those primetime hours. So it doesn't have to set up negotiations with like 200 local stations every time it wants to place an ad. And advertisers don't need to do this either. An advertiser can just go to NBC, and NBC can say, well, we've got 200 affiliated stations across the United States. You put your ad with us, and we can make sure it goes right across the continental United States. So it's a very effective way, basically, of getting advertising across the country. But that also means that there's lots of revenue coming into NBC. So it's a good way of spreading the cost of producing the service in the first place. So, networking is a good way of spreading the cost of providing a national service across a range of affiliates who take up the slack, if you like, who take up the cost of bringing a service to particular markets. But it's also a way, basically, of bringing in revenue for the central network for NBC or CBS or ABC from lots of markets across the United States. And it also, from the perspective of advertisers, means that an advertiser doesn't have to do like 200 separate deals to do an ad that's across the US. They just go to one network, and that allows them to access a national audience. And it is absolutely vital to the success of a network that you've got access to local affiliates. In the 1920s, the movie studio MGM attempted to branch out and set up a competing network with NBC. And it did manage to get 40 affiliates. Its problem, however, was that it was never able to convince AT&T to allow MGM to use AT&T's telephone wires to rebroadcast its signal across the United States. And as a consequence of that, MGM's basically attempt to set up a network was doomed to failure. Oddly enough, having moved out of the radio market in 1926, radio would still end up being a very significant source of revenue for AT&T. Because the networking, that is the transmission of radio signals across the United States, depended upon access to telephone lines, that meant basically you had to access AT&T's monopoly of telephone lines. And as you can see, by the 1950s, 40% of all of AT&T's revenues were coming from radio networking.